Margaret Wilson. Edna's shrill voice shattered the morning calm. Open this door right now. Inside, Margaret's trembling hands nearly dropped her morning tea. At 72, the retired schoolteacher had faced her share of challenges, but nothing quite like the woman who'd appointed herself neighborhood tyrant 6 months ago. The pounding continued. I know you're in there. Don't make me call the authorities. Margaret slowly made her way to the door, making each step a careful consideration. Through the peephole, she could see Edna's face contorted with self-righteous anger. Mrs. Davidson? Margaret's soft voice carried through the door. It's 7 in the morning. That's President Davidson to you, Edna snapped, smoothing her designer blazer. And as HOA president, I can conduct business whenever I see fit. Now open this door or I'll have it removed for violation of Article 7, Section B. All doors must be properly operational. Margaret opened the door, standing tall despite her small frame. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, her floral housecoat pristine, a stark contrast to Edna's aggressive stance. I'm serving you with an eviction notice. Edna thrust the red envelope forward, her red-painted lips curling into a cruel smile. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises. Margaret's face went pale. Eviction? But this is my house. I've owned it outright for 20 years. Well, Edna's voice dripped with false sympathy. Maybe you should have thought about that before violating 17 HOA regulations. She pulled out her phone, starting to record. Your garden gnomes are 3 inches too tall. Your roses are an unapproved shade of red. And don't even get me started on that bird feeder. Those rules weren't in place when They are now, Edna cut her off sharply. And as HOA president, I have the authority to enforce them. We have standards to maintain, and frankly, Margaret, you're bringing down property values with your... She gestured dismissively at Margaret's immaculate garden, senior citizen aesthetic. Margaret's voice quavered, but her spine straightened, the same way it had during 40 years of teaching 4th grade. I don't believe you have the authority to... Oh, I have all the authority. Edna leaned in, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. I have connections with the city council, the police department, and the mayor's office. Who do you think they'll believe? A distinguished HOA president or some forgetful old lady who can't even keep her mailbox at the regulation 42-inch height? And with that, Edna, the woman who'd been dubbed HOA Karen, marched down the garden path, leaving Margaret trembling in her doorway. She didn't notice Mrs. Elizabeth, already dialing Margaret's granddaughter, Sarah Edna Davidson, had just picked the wrong grandmother to mess with. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments and hit subscribe if you're against bullying and mistreatment. Cedar Lane had always been a quiet suburban paradise. For 30 years, number 42 had been home to Margaret Wilson, a retired schoolteacher whose garden was the pride of the neighborhood. Her roses had won the county fair blue ribbon 3 years running, and her famous lemon cookies could make even the grumpiest neighbor smile. At 72, Margaret had earned her peaceful retirement. Her modest home held 3 decades of memories, teaching countless children at Cedar Lane Elementary, raising her daughter Susan, and watching her grandchildren play among her beloved garden gnomes. But peace on Cedar Lane was about to be disturbed. The Newman house at number 38 had just sold, and its new owner was about to change everything. Edna Davidson arrived on a Tuesday morning, designer handbag swinging from her arm, blonde haircut in that distinctive angular bob that seemed to scream, "I'd like to speak to your manager." The morning after Edna Davidson moved into Cedar Lane, every mailbox held a crisp white envelope. Inside was a letter announcing her self-appointment as interim HOA president, following what she called an emergency board meeting that none of the residents could recall attending. But it was the second page that made longtime residents like Margaret Wilson feel a chill, a new list of regulations printed in aggressive red ink. Effective immediately, the letter declared, all exterior decorations, paint colors, and landscaping must be approved by the HOA president personally. At the bottom, in Edna's sharp handwriting, was a note that would spark the beginning of Cedar Lane's nightmare. Non-compliance will result in immediate financial penalties. For 3 decades, Margaret's garden had been her sanctuary. Every rosebush held a memory, the yellow ones planted when her husband passed, the pink ones marking her retirement, the red ones her grandchildren helped plant each spring. But Edna Davidson didn't see memories. She saw an opportunity. The first strike came at dawn. Margaret was having her morning tea when the pounding started. There stood Edna, clipboard in hand, designer heels sinking into Margaret's pristine lawn. Your garden gnomes, Edna's voice dripped with manufactured authority, are 3 inches above regulation height. That'll be $500 per gnome. It wasn't about the gnomes. Everyone on Cedar Lane knew that. This was about power, about control, about breaking the spirit of a neighborhood that had dared to exist peacefully before Edna Davidson arrived. The fines kept coming. $700 for wind chimes that disrupted community acoustics, $1,000 for roses that bloomed too vibrantly, $2,000 for a bird feeder that attracted non-approved species. But Edna Davidson had made a fatal mistake. She thought Margaret Wilson was just another quiet grandmother she could bully into submission. She didn't know about the 40 years Margaret spent taming unruly fourth graders, or about her granddaughter Sarah, whose legal firm specialized in property rights violations. She didn't know that Mrs. Elizabeth across the street had been documenting every interaction, every fabricated rule, every abuse of power. Most importantly, Edna Karen Davidson didn't know about her own past catching up to her, about the 3 other neighborhoods she'd terrorized before Cedar Lane, about the investigations that were about to reopen, about the paper trail that would expose everything. Margaret sat at her kitchen table that evening, looking at the growing pile of citations. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. For the first time since Edna Davidson arrived, Margaret smiled. Tomorrow, she would make a phone call. Tomorrow, the real war would begin, because Karen had just picked a fight with the wrong grandmother. And Cedar Lane was about to learn what happened when you pushed a retired teacher too far. The morning after reviewing her growing pile of citations, Margaret Wilson picked up her phone. 40 years of teaching had taught her one thing: bullies only win when you stay silent. Sarah, it's Grandma. I need your help with something. Her granddaughter's response was immediate. Is this about the HOA president, Grandma? Mrs. Elizabeth sent me some disturbing videos. That woman thinks she can intimidate me out of my own home. Margaret's voice was steady, determined, just like she's trying to do to everyone else on Cedar Lane. Give me 24 hours, Sarah said. Something about this whole situation doesn't add up. That same morning, Edna Davidson's voice blasted through a megaphone, shattering the neighborhood's peace. Mandatory emergency HOA meeting, all residents required to attend. Non-attendance will result in immediate fines. The community center filled quickly. Edna stood at the front, her blonde bob catching the fluorescent lights, her smile sharp as a knife. Due to numerous violations of our community standards, I'm implementing new regulations. She pulled out a thick stack of papers. All exterior activities must now be pre-approved. Gardening requires supervision. Visitors need written permission. Any gatherings of more than 2 residents will be considered unauthorized assemblies. On what authority? The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Margaret Wilson, standing tall despite her 72 years. Edna's smile faltered for just a moment. Excuse me? I asked, on what authority? Where in our HOA bylaws does it give you the power to make these demands? Edna's perfectly composed facade cracked slightly. I am the HOA president. Yes, Margaret interrupted, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used on countless misbehaving students. You keep saying that, but none of us recall voting for you. The room erupted in murmurs. Edna slammed her hand on the podium. This meeting is adjourned. Anyone remaining in this room will be fined for unauthorized gathering. As residents filed out, Edna cornered Margaret. You're making a very big mistake. Margaret met her gaze steadily. No, dear. The mistake was thinking you could bully a woman who spent 4 decades handling troublemakers much younger and more creative than you. Patrika couldn't believe her eyes then. She walked out of the meeting, brewing her own plans in mind. The morning after the community center showdown, Margaret heard the now familiar sound of heels clicking aggressively up her garden path, but this time was different. Edna Davidson wasn't carrying her usual citation pad. In her manicured hands was a bright red envelope. Since you want to question my authority, Edna's voice dripped with venom, maybe this will make things clearer. She thrust the envelope at Margaret. An eviction notice. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises. Margaret's 40 years of teaching experience kept her voice steady. This is my home. I've owned it outright for 30 years. Not anymore. Edna's smile was pure poison. Article 15, Section C of the new HOA regulations. Any resident displaying continued defiance of community standards forfeits their right to property ownership. I wrote it myself, just for you. You can't just make up rules. I can do whatever I want. Edna's composure cracked. I own this neighborhood now. You're just a stubborn old woman who doesn't know when to give up. 72 hours, Margaret. Then I'll have you removed myself. As Edna stormed away, Margaret picked up her phone. Her hands weren't shaking. They were steady with purpose. Sarah, it's time. She just served me with an eviction notice. What? Sarah's voice was sharp with anger. She can't do that. She thinks she can, and she's threatening to have me forcibly removed. I've been digging into her background, Grandma. Give me a few more hours. She's not who she claims to be. This isn't the first neighborhood she's tried to terrorize. That evening, Sarah worked furiously, connecting the dots. 3 different communities, 3 different names, a pattern of fraudulent HOA takeovers and stolen funds. The evidence was damning. As the sun rose over Cedar Lane the next morning, every mailbox held an envelope. Not Edna Davidson's usual citations, but page after page of her previous schemes. Phoenix, where she was Janet Thompson. Seattle, where she went by Susan Roberts. Miami, where she called herself Edna Wells. Different names, same predatory tactics. And now Cedar Lane was about to witness the confrontation that would change everything. The morning sun had barely risen when Edna Davidson's scream of rage shattered the peace of Cedar Lane. She burst out of her house, still in her silk pajamas, clutching the evidence packet that had exposed her carefully constructed facade. Within minutes, she was storming down Margaret's garden path, her bare feet slapping against the pavement, her perfectly maintained bob now wild and disheveled. This wasn't the composed HOA tyrant anymore. This was a woman whose schemes were crumbling around her. You think you're so clever? Edna's voice was unrecognizable, raw with fury. You think you can just dig into my past and threaten me? Margaret opened her door calmly, exactly as she had done with countless angry parents over her teaching years. Good morning, Edna. Or do you prefer Janet? Maybe Susan? Shut up! Edna thrust a finger at Margaret's face. You have no idea what I'm capable of. I've destroyed people far more powerful than you. One phone call. That's all it takes. One call to my friends in the city council. Your friends? Margaret's voice remained steady. You mean like Councilman Peters? I just got off the phone with him. Fascinating man. He was very interested to hear about your various identities. The FBI agents he contacted were even more interested. Edna's face went from red to white in an instant. Phone call. Behind her, neighbors were emerging from their homes, phones raised, recording everything. Mrs. Elizabeth was already live streaming. Mr. Rodriguez had his camera aimed squarely at Edna's increasingly erratic behavior. This is my neighborhood. Edna's voice rose to a shriek. I own all of you. Get out! Get out of this house! And there it was. The moment that would soon go viral across social media. The moment Cedar Lane's HOA Karen finally showed her true colors. Little did she know, Sarah Wilson was already pulling into the street with 2 FBI agents in tow. As Edna Davidson's rage echoed through Cedar Lane, a black SUV turned the corner. Sarah Wilson stepped out first, her legal briefcase in hand. Behind her, 2 FBI agents emerged, their badges catching the morning sun. Edna Davidson? One agent's voice cut through her screaming. Or should we say Janet Thompson? We'd like to talk about your activities in Phoenix. Edna froze mid-rant, her finger still pointed at Margaret. The color drained from her face as realization dawned. Her carefully constructed world was collapsing. You don't understand. Edna's voice shifted, suddenly sickly sweet. This is all a misunderstanding. I'm just trying to maintain property values, to keep our community safe. Safe? Margaret's voice carried across the now silent street. By terrorizing elderly residents, by inventing fake rules, by stealing HOA funds from 3 other communities before coming here. Sarah stepped forward, opening her briefcase. We have the records, Miss Davidson. Every fraudulent fee, every dollar stolen, every fake identity. Phoenix wasn't your first stop, was it? But Cedar Lane will be your last. Edna's eyes darted wildly, looking for an escape route. But Cedar Lane's residents had formed a circle around her, phones recording every moment. Mrs. Elizabeth's live stream had already reached 10,000 viewers. You can't prove anything, Edna snarled, but her voice trembled. I have rights. Yes, Margaret said softly, just like we all have rights. Rights you tried to steal with fake rules and fraudulent eviction notices. Edna Davidson's carefully constructed world was crumbling before her eyes. Her designer pajamas were soaked with sweat, her signature bob completely disheveled. Gone was the poised HOA tyrant who had terrorized Cedar Lane. You think you've won? Her voice rose hysterically. I still have the HOA documents. I still own this neighborhood. She pulled crumpled papers from her silk robe pocket. Actually, Sarah stepped forward, these are the real HOA documents. Notice the official seal? The ones you've been using are forgeries, just like your identity. The FBI agents moved closer. Mrs. Thompson, or Miss Davidson, you're under investigation for multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement across 4 states. No, Edna lunged toward Margaret. She stepped aside smoothly, leaving Edna to stumble on her own garden path. This is all your fault, Edna screamed at Margaret from the ground. You stupid old woman. You should have just paid the fines like everyone else. Should have just given up your house. And that's assault on video, Sarah announced, nodding to Mrs. Elizabeth's live stream. Would you like to add that to the charges? As the FBI agents helped Edna to her feet and began reading her rights, she made one last desperate attempt. Don't you people understand? I was making this neighborhood better. These old people, these immigrants, they were ruining property values. I was saving Cedar Lane. The entire street fell silent. Then Margaret's voice, clear and strong, cut through the tension. No, dear, you weren't saving anything. You were just a bully who picked the wrong neighborhood and the wrong grandmother. Edna Davidson was indeed arrested by the FBI. Criminal charges were filed against her for multiple offenses, including fraud, identity theft, embezzlement, harassment, falsifying legal documents. With Edna removed, Cedar Lane returned to its peaceful state. Margaret Wilson and her neighbors celebrated their victory, restoring the neighborhood's sense of community and mutual respect. The street once again became the quiet, harmonious suburban paradise it had been before Edna's arrival.